Hey, Zach here. Today I'm in Pennsylvania on the hottest day of the year, but that's not keeping me inside or the many other people that are waiting by the very active railroad crossing behind me. What they're waiting for is actually a historic event. The Big Boy Locomotive is going to pass through here any minute. Now, if you're unsure what the Big Boy Locomotive actually is, what makes it so special, what its history is, while we wait, let's discuss it. The Union Pacific Railroad, in the mid-20th century, was comprised of thousands of miles of track, stretching from the West Coast to an eastern terminus in Chicago. Such a sprawling network covered multiple different terrain types, including the Great Plains, deserts, and multiple mountain ranges. The Rocky Mountains presented a particular challenge for the railroad, especially in the Wasatch Range east of Ogden, Utah, and at Sherman Hill, west of Cheyenne, Wyoming. During the first half of the 20th century, the Union Pacific's route through these two areas experienced a grade of over 1%, meaning the track rose more than 1 foot per every 100 feet traveled. That might not seem like much, but such grades can severely limit a locomotive's ability to pull fully loaded trains over the mountains. In the mid-1930s, Union Pacific worked with the American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, to design the Challenger-type locomotive. Conceived to handle the mountain grades, the Challengers were huge locomotives in their own right. At 122 feet long, they weighed approximately 1 million pounds and supplied about 5,000 horsepower. For steam locomotives, you will often see a dashed number designation, like the 4664 denoted here. This represents the wheel arrangement of the locomotive. In this case, the numbers tell us that there are 4 leading wheels to help guide the locomotive into curves. Then there are 2 sets of 6 powered driving wheels, followed by 4 trailing wheels that help to support the rear of the locomotive. The fact that there are 2 sets of drive wheels essentially means that the Challenger acted as 2 separate steam engines placed under a single large boiler. Because of its long length, the Challenger utilized an articulated design, wherein the front set of driving wheels could pivot independently of the rear set, allowing the locomotive to handle sharper curves. One final specification is important for the Challenger, and that is its tractive effort of approximately 97,000 pounds. This represents the total pulling force generated by the locomotive, and is in fact different from the engine's power. Think of tractive effort as how much weight the locomotive can move, and horsepower as how fast it can move it. The tractive effort of an engine is derived from a number of physical characteristics, including wheel diameter and the locomotive's own weight. When the Union Pacific took possession of the first Challengers in 1936, it quickly discovered that while the locomotive could haul heavy cargo at high speeds on level ground, it couldn't handle the steep grades very well. A typical 50-car train would often require 2 Challengers, along with some additional helpers, to conquer the mountains. So the Union Pacific design team went back to the drawing board, again working with the American Locomotive Company to see if they could improve on the Challenger's design, and come up with an engine that could handle the mountain grades single-handedly. They enlarged the firebox size, which in turn increased boiler pressure, such that the new engine would be able to generate steam faster than it could use it. They added more driver wheels, and actually slightly reduced their diameter, allowing for better weight balance and overall more grip on the tracks. Incidentally, some of these design improvements would make their way into later versions of the Challenger. The new locomotive was almost named the Wasatch, after the mountain range in Utah that it was designed to traverse. But an unnamed worker at the Alco plant in Schenectady chalked the name Big Boy on the unfinished boiler, and the name stuck. The so-called Big Boy was longer and heavier than its predecessor, with a similar articulated design. But it was the increased power and tractive effort that allowed the Big Boy to achieve the engineering goals of the Union Pacific, namely conquering the Rocky Mountains. The locomotive had no trouble pulling loaded freight trains single-handedly, and its arrival in the early 1940s meant that it was instrumental in efficiently moving massive wartime freight volume over the mountains. 25 big boys were built between 1941 and 1944. They were numbered 4000 to 4024, and here we see the first in the series, 4000, fresh off the assembly line and presented in this publicity photo in 1941. The Union Pacific put the big boys to work on the Wasatch Grade, east of Ogden, Utah, where the tracks ascend 3,000 feet to the summit of the Wasatch Range. And this stretch of track between Ogden and Cheyenne, Wyoming, would be their main operating region over their roughly 2 decades of service. But even these behemoths couldn't survive the continuing march of progress. By 1959, with the increased price of coal fuel and the advent of efficient, cost-effective diesel-electric locomotives, the big boys were withdrawn from service. And where once a single mighty steam locomotive could be seen at the head of a loaded freight train, now a string of less powerful diesels are needed to accomplish the same task. Unfortunately, many of the 25 big boys were scrapped over the years, but 8 of them do still remain intact. Most are on display at various locations throughout the country, with the easternmost one at the Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania. In 2006, when I first got to see it on display at Steamtown, it was looking pretty sad, but it has since gone through cosmetic restoration and looks much more presentable these days. Now, the big boy is obviously a very large locomotive, and this graphic from the Union Pacific website helps to put its size in perspective relative to other well-known vehicles. The locomotive is longer than 3 school buses, and more than half as long as a Boeing 747. Additionally, we see that it is nearly twice the length of modern diesel engines. But was Big Boy actually the largest and most powerful locomotive ever? The answer on both counts is no. Let's consider 3 other locomotives that were contemporaries of the Big Boy: the Chesapeake and Ohio H8 Allegheny, the Pennsylvania Railroad Q2, and the Pennsy S1. Here we'll compare a number of specs between the Big Boy and these other massive locomotives. In terms of units produced, the Big Boy is middle of the road between the Allegheny's whopping 60 and the S1's single unit. But the Big Boy clearly wins in years of service. In addition to a longer lifespan than any of the other contenders, it survived the longest before ultimately being replaced by diesels in 1959. Moving on to physical characteristics, the S1 wins as the largest reciprocating steam locomotive ever built, at a length of 140 feet, including the tender. For weight, the Big Boy and the Allegheny are essentially tied for heaviest, at about 1.2 million pounds. As for the performance specs, Big Boy is actually the lowest horsepower of the bunch, but it makes up for it with its huge tractive effort, which was essential for climbing the mountain grades in Utah and Wyoming. Indeed, it should be noted that the other 3 engines all primarily operated east of the Mississippi, and therefore were mostly designed for speed or heavy hauling over smaller grades. Turning our attention towards what remains of these mammoth engines, the Pennsy locomotives have unfortunately all been lost to history. There are a couple Alleghenys left, one of which is at the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. But the Big Boy wins this category with nearly 1/3 of its production run still intact. Moreover, one of these has even been returned to operational status. For decades, 4014 sat at the Rail Giants Train Museum in Pomona, California. In 2013, the Union Pacific reacquired the engine, intending to restore it to operational status for excursion service. The railroad transported the Big Boy back to its home territory in Cheyenne, Wyoming, to complete the lengthy restoration process, which included a complete disassembly of the locomotive. Aside from the fabrication of new parts, the restoration work included converting the locomotive from coal to oil burning. By 2019, with restoration complete, 4014 became the largest operating steam locomotive in the world. and it even had a replica of the original Big Boy graffiti on the front of the engine. It made its first excursion run as part of the 150th anniversary celebration of the first transcontinental railroad. Since then, it's been involved in a number of excursions, mostly west of the Mississippi. Interestingly, Ed Dickens, senior manager of heritage operations for Union Pacific, who oversaw the 6-year restoration process of 4014, now acts as its chief engineer, and can often be seen at the controls of 4014. In 2026, as part of the United States' 250th anniversary, 4014 is making an historic coast-to-coast tour, including its first trip to the east since its construction in the early 1940s. This tour included such historic events as the Big Boy crossing the Tunkanunk Viaduct in Nicholson, Pennsylvania, a meetup with 4012 at Steamtown, and a side-by-side race with Reading and Northern's 2102 steam locomotive. The tour eventually brings 4014 to Philadelphia for the 4th of July, and it was on the way there that I finally got to see it, as it passed through my hometown of Reading, Pennsylvania. I chose a spot north of Reading, where 4014 is still on Reading and Northern tracks, because it gave me a chance to check out the excursion train that is running just ahead of the Big Boy. And here it comes now. Wow, that thing wasn't just huge, but it was loud too. Check out that police officer in the foreground holding his ears. You'll notice that the Big Boy was pulling an interesting consist. After the tender, which holds the fuel oil, there were 2 auxiliary water tenders designated Joe Jordan and Jim Adams. These were followed by 3 diesel locomotives. Union Pacific's own 1616, a commemorative heritage unit honoring Abraham Lincoln, Norfolk Southern's 1776, custom painted for the America's 250 Locomotive series, and Union Pacific's 1776 with the America 250 logo. These diesels aren't needed for their power, but to provide braking assistance, modern safety controls, and insurance against breakdowns. Following the diesels was a number of cars from the Union Pacific Heritage Fleet. These serve such functions as providing crew quarters, supplying electricity, and carrying maintenance equipment. The train was rounded out by a set of 3 Norfolk Southern passenger cars and a 1927 Pullman private luxury rail car named Marco Polo that was once the personal presidential car for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. After passing here, 4014 proceeded to the Reading and Northern's outer station, just north of Reading, where crowds of people waited to greet it. I opted to avoid this spot, using the time to move to another location further south on the route, after the train crosses onto Norfolk Southern tracks. With any luck, not a lot of people will think to go to this location. Well, that railroad crossing was a little crowded, but I found another place a little bit further down the tracks where there's almost no people at. Plus, there's a really cool bridge right behind me that will see the big boy going over. It should be getting here any time now. Oh, I definitely hear something coming. Oh, false alarm. That's not the train we're looking for. I guess with the big boy getting onto Norfolk Southern tracks now, it's gonna face a lot more competition from increased freight traffic. Okay, there's another train coming. This has to be it. Witnessing the big boy in action for the first time is a dream come true for a lifelong railfan like me. While I hope these recordings give you a glimpse of what it's like, they can never fully convey the power, the sound, or the presence of this engineering marvel. If you ever have the opportunity to see it for yourself, it's an experience you'll never forget. Well, I hope you like these looks at the big boy locomotive, both its history and its present. Also, check out my Patreon for bonus videos and photos. Until next time, see you later.